Hello everyone, in this endgame video I'm going to introduce this idea of the rule of the square, and then we're going to look at two really beautiful positions and puzzles where you can use this idea of the rule of the square to win the game. So first of all, we have to kind of understand what is the rule of the square, and this is kind of a method that you can use to very quickly find out if your pawn is close enough to promote. Because you can, in this position here, simply calculate and say, pawn to b5, king to f4, pawn to b6, king to e5, but that can get very hard and confusing, and sometimes it's much more simple to use this rule of the square, which is simply saying you make a square. If you're playing online, you can maybe actually draw this, but over the board just mentally picture a square that you can make with your pawn, and one of the sides is the side of the board where you're promoting. And if your opponent's king is inside that square or on the border of the square, then your opponent's king can defend the pawn. But if not, then you're going to promote. So here, if it's white to move, you can play b5, and notice that black has no way to get into the square. They're too far away. They can only go to f4, and you're very comfortably going to promote here. Whereas if instead it was black to move, so let's say king to g1 was played, then suddenly king to f4 can be played. And what has just happened? Well, black has stepped into the square of this b4 pawn, and even though it's white to move, it doesn't matter. If your opponent steps into your pawn square, it doesn't matter who's to move, they're close enough to stop the pawn. So b5 here, king to e5, notice stepping back into the square. b6 making the square smaller, but again black steps into it. b7 making it again smaller, but black steps into it, and it's clear that black will be able to stop this queen, or this pawn, from becoming a queen. And so this is a very basic idea, but it is kind of helpful, and as you're going to see in these next two following positions, it can be really a crucial idea that can help you win the game in a really beautiful manner. Now we're going to kind of build up the beauty of these positions. So this first one here, don't get me wrong, it's cool, but it's a bit more basic, and the next position is just going to take this whole concept to a whole new level. So let's start with this one though, and a quick check and scan of the position will tell you that your only hope here is to somehow promote this pawn. This one obviously can't promote, they're just going to take it, but this one might have a chance to promote because there's no pawn on B or A file that can really challenge this A pawn. Also, you'll understand that this king here on f1 is not very active, while the one here on f3 is much more in the game. And so it seems like black might have a nice little edge here. And then you can kind of check this rule of the square. Now, as you can see here, black is definitely comfortably in this square here, but the one thing to remember is that this pawn is on a2, so you can move to a4 in one move. And once you do, black will not be in the square, but black will have the ability to go into the square. And so by checking this rule of the square, it might seem like black is simply winning here. They're going to pick up this pawn here, and then proceed to take their two-pawn advantage and simply win here. However, you can have, or you can use this really nice concept here. And one of the key things to understand is that when it comes to this rule of the square, it only works assuming that black will take the shortest path to the promoting square. So if black decided instead to go to e3 and then to e4 and then to d3, obviously this whole rule of the square just doesn't apply to that position. And that takes you to this really genius move, d5. Why is it so genius? Well, first of all, they have to take it, otherwise you continue with d6 and promote your pawn. So they have to take it. But now you can kind of see what you've done. You've obstructed black's path with their king to get to a8, and now they're going to have to, in some way, make a longer path, which gives you just enough time to promote your pawn. Because here, notice, they are in the square, but we can see an exception because they cannot access this d5 square, which is the shortest path and the only path that allows them to stay in the square when it comes time when white promotes when white pushes the pawn to a5. And so after a5, black would love to go to d5, but their own pawn is there. And so they have to go to d4 or to e5. Regardless, you are now well in time to promote to a queen and win the game. So a really fascinating exception of the rule here, where if black cannot come to the promotion square in the fastest way possible, even if they are in the square, it might not be enough for black to hold the pawn, and you might be able to promote. Now let's go ahead and take this to a whole new level. Bam! So in this position, it seems very, very hopeless. I mean, black's king is just 10 times more active than your king. Black can quickly take these pawns, and it seems as though black easily can control this a8 square, because if you look at this rule of the square, well, as you can notice, black is definitely in the square. So if you were to push a5 here, then black can take on d5, a6, black can come to c6, and now to b7, and very quickly you can tell that black will be able to stop your pawn. And once that happens, these pawns here are very easily just going to become queens. And so it seems like it might be time to resign. But then we can you can think and use a very similar idea to the last position, where you're going to obstruct black's path. And the thing to understand here is that to get to a8, black has to access a number of squares, but we'll be looking at this c6 square. If black cannot access this c6 square, then this whole thing does not work, because after a5, king takes d5, a6, black must go to c6. Otherwise, black will simply be taking too much time, and you're going to be able to promote. And you can use this very fact that you've just created to get to this move d6. And the idea is, well, if they go c6, well, clearly they're blocking the c6 square, and after a5, king to d5, a6, they can't come to c6. They can only come and take on c5, but again, that is too slow from black. Now, if instead they take, you have to be very precise here. You cannot take on d6, because then they take, and I mean, they're definitely close enough here. Instead, you play this really genius move, c6, sacrificing your second pawn. But if they take, and they have to take, because otherwise you promote, well, guess what? Again, they're blocking c6, which is a very key square here, because after a5, king d5, a6, they need access to c6, which they don't have. They have to take a longer path, for example, going c5, and now you promote. So just a really beautiful double pawn sacrifice here that obstructs the path that black has to promoting. So if you're trying to kind of process this logically and kind of think of how you can think of these positions and find these moves, well, you just need to realize your king can't really play a role, so it's kind of only about your pawns here. And you have to realize, well, is black in the square? If they're not, then you can just push. But if they are, what are the key squares that they must be able to use? And so here, for example, b7 would be one of those, or c6, as we're using here, or even d5. And if you can somehow control one of those squares, and this in this case d6 allows you to take over on c6 and I guess obstruct the path here on c6. If you can do that to one of these squares, then you're going to be most likely able to promote. And so this really genius idea of using a really awesome exception to the rule of the square. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, learned a really awesome endgame technique, enjoyed these positions. Subscribe if you're new around here. Make sure you guys like this video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.